Good afternoon, and welcome to our New York Archives Magazine online speaker series. I'm Josie Madison, editor of New York Archives. Today will be a thought-provoking hour with Commissioner Richard Ball as we explore how New York's fertile farmland became a crucial resource during the Revolutionary War. Together, we will uncover the stories of the region's farmers, soldiers, and communities who transformed the state's rich soil into the breadbasket that fed an army and sustained the cause for independence. Richard Ball is the commissioner of the New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets. A native New Yorker, Mr. Ball has made a living in agriculture his entire life. Commissioner Ball has held a number of positions within agriculture and community organizations at the local, state, and national levels, including in the New York State Vegetable Growers Association, the New York Farm Bureau, the American Farm Bureau, and the Schoharie County Chamber of Commerce. He was honored to serve as the president of the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture from 2021 to 2022, where he helped guide the implementation of the organization's priorities and policies adopted at its 2021 annual meeting. He is also the former president of Food Export Northeast. Commissioner Ball, along with his wife Shirley, reside on their farm in Schoharie and appreciate having 3 generations engaged in the farm operation. Tom Rutler retired from his position as New York State Archivist, a role he held since 2015. An active professional for 35 years, he's the author of several peer-reviewed journal articles and reviews on the use of technology in archives and the preservation of records in electronic form. Tom has been a consultant for several state governments and other organizations focusing on electronic records management and preservation. He remains actively engaged as a board member and steward of the Archives Partnership Trust. Welcome to all of you who have joined us today. If you have questions throughout the presentation, we will set aside a few minutes at the end to answer those questions. So you can feel free to ask those questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen throughout the presentation, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. And now I'm pleased to introduce Commissioner Richard Ball and Tom Ruller.
Thank you very much, Josie. Commissioner, great to see you again.
Great to be with you, Tom.
I'm really happy. This is a great topic. And of course, we're in the middle of, or the beginning of the semi-quincentennial. And a lot of folks talk about the Revolutionary War in terms of battles and generals and so on. But food is essential. And being able to keep people and armies fed is critical to the success of either side of the war. And New York was an enormously important place for the delivery of food. And I'm so happy that you're able to share a little bit with us about how important New York was as a food source and a supplier to the people and the armies that were here in the United States. So maybe we can start just with that first question. Why was New York such a strategically important food source during the Revolutionary War?
That's a fun topic for me, especially. But it takes me back to my 8th grade New York history class. If you think back at the colonies, the original colonies, and the Snowball War for Independence is going on. If you look at the map, I know the British looked at the map very hard, but they looked at New York as the wedge in between the New England states and the southern colonies. I vividly remember sitting in my 8th grade history class and thinking about the lessons that I was about to learn, where the British said, if we can split New York, we can divide the colonies in half. It would be much easier for us to proceed with the war effort. So I remember General Howe's plan to come up the Hudson from New York, Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne to come down Lake Champlain from the north, another group of British soldiers to come from the west through Oriskany, and the goal was for the 3 prongs to meet in Albany, and then they would have split New York, split the colonies. What a great success and what a great battle plan that was. So for Schoharie, we still have a saying in Schoharie that the past is always present. Because we figured into that. We were part of those prongs coming together. Known as the breadbasket of the revolutions, everyone in Schoharie's got that tattooed somewhere in their brain or on their wrist. To have such good farmland and to have fed Washington's troops during the Revolutionary War. It all came together in such a concentrated form for us there. Such an emotional thing for a farmer to feel like they're part of history every time they go out on their farm.
You mentioned Schoharie. I thought I took a couple of slides here, and I thought I might take a quick show people a little bit of what we're talking about when we talk about Schoharie. And whoops. This is the Schoharie Valley.
Yep.
Today, probably looking towards the south.
It's looking south towards South Mountain at the very end, the biggest mountain you can see to the south, to the far end there, South Mountain. And you're on top of Roman's Nose here. One of the most wonderful hikes for an expensive view you'll ever do. And you're looking down at farms that are currently farmed in the valley, but you get a sense of kind of a special place. Millions of years of sediment, and the Schoharie Creek, you can just see a little bit of that glistening of the creek there that created these rolling fields leading down to the flats, what we call the flats in Schoharie. There's about 18 feet of topsoil there on those fields that you're looking at.
Wow.
Incredibly productive because of the deep soil. You know, typical farmland might have 8 or 10 inches or a foot of topsoil and then subsoil, rocks, gravel, whatever. But in Schoharie, it's the same soil at the very top, down about 12 to 18 feet. Wow. So even back then, you know, the root of a wheat or a corn, whatever that was planted, could go as deep as it wanted to go, capture as much nutrients as it could. So we always had more production in the Schoharie Valley than any other land.
And that's a historical fact. It's just to give everybody a sense of where we're talking about. That's Schoharie County within the context of all of New York State.
Kind of looks like the heart, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. It very much does. This is a picture from 1915 of the valley. Again, agriculture. The production of food is a long-term legacy of what Schoharie does. Here's a 1787 map of Schoharie County at the time, drawn by Simeon DeWitt, who was the Surveyor General of New York State. The Schoharie Valley has been central to agricultural production in New York for a very, very long time. So I'm going to stop my share. When people think about well, you've just mentioned it. What role did New York farmland and food production play during the war? Were there a lot of sort of purchases by the Continental Army, or was it foraging, or how did the valley supply the army?
Yeah, it was largely the grains that were raised in the valley by farmers who found that they were able to get higher yields than anywhere else because of that deep soil, because of that tradition. The pH, for the people who garden know that a pH of around 7 is really good for most crops. And because the hillsides that surround the valley are largely composed of limestone, you know, all the caves there's 200 miles of caves in Schoharie County. Howe Caverns is famous. They're limestone caves. So every time it would rain, some of that limestone would wash down onto the flats. So naturally high pH, naturally deep soil, a fine silt loam. It's very, very productive. And because of that, the farmers there were able to produce more than they needed. They could feed themselves. And of course, a big customer at that time was George Washington's armies. Got to keep them fed if we're going to be healthy enough for battle every day. And so much of the food from the Schoharie Valley wound up helping to do that. And it was strategic because we were centrally located on the Schoharie Creek, close to the Mohawk, not too far from the Hudson. So it was an appropriate place to have a good farming background.
Were there other areas of the state that also produced foodstuffs for?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. The Hudson Valley, great growing area, still today, historically, kind of the doorstep to New York City and the population there. So all the way up the Hudson Valley was also a key area. They didn't have the wide open fields that we have in Schoharie, the flats. They had more rolling hills, but also productive land.
The supplying the army was one dimension, but supplying the population. You mentioned the farmers in the Schoharie Valley were able to feed themselves and their families. Were they able to supply the civilian population as well during the war?
Absolutely. And of course, at that time, Schoharie was kind of the western edge of civilization as we knew it. So almost everything trafficked to the east, to Albany, up to Schenectady. Along the Mohawk, we had populations, Amsterdam, Canajoharie, people that were able to see some manufacturing due to the water power that settled along that river. And so that's the flow of goods went to the north and to the east towards the Hudson. To get to New York City and the metropolitan areas, there was the opportunity to use those waterways to get down to New York City.
Okay. You mentioned that Schoharie was sort of at the edge of the frontier, I'll say, but during the war. Really, was there a lot of risk for the folks that are living in Schoharie to be able to do farming, but also to protect themselves?
For sure. It was not for the faint of heart back in the 1700s. The valley itself is kind of interesting. We have, and you have here at the museum, record of this, an excavation that the New York Museum did on our farm back in the 60s. They found a summer Indian camp, still referred to here, and I've seen some of the evidence of it up here, that identified 3 different eras of Indian occupation along the Fox Creek and the Schoharie Creek on our farm today. 3 different eras, one of them, fairly recent, the 1700s. I think the one before that might have been in the 1400s, and another era, and they identified that through the artifacts, the arrowheads, and the styles, going back to maybe the year 600, 400, 600, somewhere in that area. So it was always an interesting spot for the Native Americans at that time. But coincidentally, it was kind of a demilitarized zone because it was on the edge of Iroquois territory and Mohican territory. And as I understand it, reading up on the history, it was kind of a demilitarized zone. No one camped there year round. They were there in the summer for hunting and fishing. But it was kind of neat for our farm, actually, to have that piece of history. We still find arrowheads and evidence of things that, maybe were outside the edge of the excavation by the museum, but really so important to feel that every day when we take care of it.
Yeah, the use of the valley is really goes back to human. It's a human history story. It's not just a European settlement story. It is humans who are settling and using this resource.
Yeah.
I didn't have this on my questions, but did the land in the Schoharie Valley really need to be cleared in order to make it farmable? Or
the land in the county did need to be cleared in large measure. It was largely wooded. The flats kind of stayed more open because of the occasional flooding that would happen on the land. The first building that we have in the valley in the village of Schoharie, in town of Schoharie, was 1711, I think, the first evidence we had. And it was settled by, at that time, Palatines from, so Germans from the Palatine region and Dutch. I think King George named this land Romans land for the person in charge of the Holland patent back at that time from Schenectady all the way down to the Catskills, which was a vast quality of land. And so the idea of bringing in settlers there, as I mentioned, German and Dutch largely, they saw that land, saw the flats, and saw the quality of the soil and immediately went to work on it.
You mentioned the Palatine Germans who did settle a big chunk of the Mohawk Valley. I know my ancestors are part of that migration. But in terms of farming techniques, the where did they bring techniques with them from Germany or wherever they were from? Did they learn different techniques from the indigenous people that were here farming the land before them?
I think they identified the soil from where they had come. They were familiar with what kind of soil this was. And if you look at the way many of the farms still today are aligned in the Schoharie Valley, they start on the upland, on the banks, and go across like bowling alleys almost. So every farmer had some upland and a place for a woodlot, and every farmer had some of the flats, which were very special. So I think the Germans, the Palatines, the Dutch recognized the importance of that deep soil and the ability that they would have to get big yields out of that soil, different from upland and higher. It's a fine silt loam, a Barber Tioga loam, as we call it in agriculture. One of my favorite stories is in a letter in the Old Stone from the Old Stone Fort Museum, which is right on the edge of our farm. It was an original Dutch Reformed church, Dutch church. There was one in Middleburg and there was one in Schoharie. And every week a preacher would preach in Schoharie in German. He'd ride his horse to Middleburg and then preach there in Dutch. And the next Sunday he would do just the opposite to satisfy both the native populations there. But there's a story. The Old Stone Fort is now a museum. And there's a story in a letter there told by someone visiting Schoharie to visit family, coming from the Massachusetts colony. And if I talk about farming, plowing, say, a piece of land in the 1700s, I think all of us can envision a horse or an oxen farmer with rugged hands and a strong back, walking behind with a one-body plow. And in the case of the Massachusetts colony, and behind him, a field strewn with rocks.
Yes.
That needed to be picked up before anything could be done. And so this letter is written by someone who visited Schoharie from the Massachusetts colony. And the letter, he writes with exclamation points, "You can't believe what I just witnessed. I'm in the Schoharie Valley, and I just watched a 15-year-old boy plowing at a gallop behind a team of horses because the soil was so clean, had no rocks. It was deep, it was mellow, and he was able to put a team of horses on it and literally trot along behind the horses, turning the soil over without breaking anything." And it just told me this is a special place, and that they knew that early on as soon as they saw that.
So maybe unlike New England, there aren't that many stone walls in the Schoharie Valley.
Not too many. You got to go up in the hills. Then there's plenty.
You mentioned transportation and the role of the Schoharie Creek and the Mohawk River and the Hudson getting food out of the valley. Were those the primary methods for delivering food?
I think the waterways where they were handy, the Schoharie was relatively unreliable for too much.
Mm-hmm.
It's shallow in parts and snakes back and forth a lot. The Fox Creek, not something that would accommodate transportation. So the overland routes, north to Canajoharie, north to Amsterdam, those routes were well-worn paths. East towards Gallup-ville and towards Albany were well-worn paths. That's the way most things moved back then, behind teams of horses.
So probably that Route 30, what we now see as Route 30, was
That's
probably
right.
The original of the path.
Yep.
At least one of them.
Yep.
Okay.
443, 130. Those were critical access roads.
So it's almost, I think, if you want to try to re-experience what people were doing, then take a ride on one of those old roads.
That's right.
And you kind of get a sense of.
You'll see the history of agriculture.
Yes. New York has lots of those examples. Route 73 up in the Adirondacks is another one that's an ancient road, an ancient route.
Yeah.
So during the war, and I think this gets back to living on the frontier and the role of settlement. And we all know the Mohawk Valley had divided loyalties. We had the Johnson family who owned most of the land on the north side of the river. And then you had the Dutch patroons and others who had, and Johnson had some of the land on the south side. Were there some cases where there were sort of conflicts within the communities about which side are you on and how are you going to help someone?
Yes, very much so. Loyalties were divided.
Mhm.
For the Indians at the time, the Native Americans, they were divided also. They, as we know, they sided with the British, picking that as the stronger force and most likely to survive, and they along with them. I know that in Schoharie, in our village, in our town, where the stone fort is, that's where committees of safety would meet, kind of like town boards today. And I know that back in those days when people were, confused, they were worried about whether they should side with the settlers, whether they should side with the British, who they had relationships with. A lot of the businessmen wanted the best of both worlds because they sold goods to the British and they sold goods to the settlers. That was a very hard decision for them.
Mhm.
In our village, the committee of safety met, and I think I remember being part of a reenactment one time, and I think 28 out of the members there decided to side with the British. It wasn't slam dunk.
Mhm.
So that's like a third of the population
Yeah.
thought the British was a better bet. Right across from our farm was what historically had been known as the George Mann Tory Tavern. George Mann was a very well-respected restaurateur, tavern owner. Everybody liked him. It was the place to congregate, but he sided with the British. He was a Tory. And probably one of the few Tories who was invited back after the war because he was so highly regarded. But at the time, it was a very difficult decision for him to make, and he needed to escape once the battle started raging, and he did. But he came back afterwards and was welcomed. Not everyone was welcome.
Yeah, I didn't know that story that George Mann was, because there was this committee of forfeiture and all that. Did he wind? So he didn't wind up forfeiting his land?
No, he won. They were happy to have him back. It was a tavern. Let's not lose
Okay.
sight of that.
All right.
But he was highly regarded, even though he bet on the wrong team.
Wow. That's a great story to follow up on.
Yeah.
So we here in the archives we have a lot of records of treasonous acts by individuals, and many of them are. Well, I saw Joe over there selling barrels of wheat to the British,
Right.
and that was considered a treasonous act
Yep.
in New York state law at the time. And all it took was one person to accuse you, and you were convicted often. So, which is kind of sad.
Of course, stories get better as we go on, too.
Yes, yes. Well, I had another quick little map that I thought would just to talk a little bit about the role of the valley during the war and what was happening there. This is John Johnson. There were raids in the valley. This was the big raid in 1780, which affected the Schoharie Valley, the Mohawk Valley, and there are a lot of, I'll say, important battles throughout the valley and massacres. Cherry Valley was very hurt by the actions of the Tories coming through. But and again, if you look at this map and look at the map of the Schoharie Valley, they're the same places.
Yeah. The Johnson Brant raid 1780 is such a game changer in terms of so much history in the valley. They came up, that original view you had of the Schoharie Valley from Brumman's Nose, South Mountain in the background. They came up over South Mountain and came up the valley. In the middle of those flats from that picture was what was called the Upper Fort. There was a fort there. There was another fort in Middleburg called the Middle Fort. And further downstream, because the Schoharie flows to the north, in our village of Schoharie, and right by our farm, was the old stone fort, which was built out of stone. The other two were wooden largely. stockade around the middle of those flats, if you can picture that. And they started there and worked their way up the valley, setting fire to all the crops, burning all the meat, burning all the grains, setting fire to the forest, setting fire to every house they could find.
Mm-hmm.
So one, you know, on our farm, it was a Vroman farm. The Vroman family figured very prominently all through the valley. There are very few houses older than 1780 because just about every house, every wooden structure, with the exception of the old stone fort, which was stone, was destroyed. And after that battle, the ruin of the valley, it was just devastating for the inhabitants to look back and see the crops ruined, their houses burned. That had to have been one tough winter.
Yeah.
Without storage, without crops in the barn. How do you feed your animals? Many of whom were taken.
Mm-hmm.
That was a pretty tough time, as I can imagine. But they got to the old stone fort in Schoharie after laying waste to the valley all the way up, which is probably 6 or 8 miles from that view from Brummond's Nose up to the village of Schoharie. They started to head off towards Cobleskill and further west towards Cherry Valley.
Mm-hmm.
And so they actually, after they left the old stone fort, crossed our farm, heading up the Schoharie Creek towards those other destinations. So I have found on the farm a 2-pound shot, which was, not something that the colonials had. Right? So it's probably dropped by the British as they, left the village of Schoharie, the intersection of the Fox Creek and the Schoharie Creek to head further north and make their way eventually towards Saratoga.
Mm-hmm.
But so to put yourself back in those days, to find in the fall, just as crops were ripening, getting ready for harvest, to see all of that wasted, to see your houses and barns burned, had to be one heck of a blow.
Yes, yes. And you're losing all those people to actually work the land,
yeah.
And also either murdered or run away or whatever. Another great story that of perseverance and people getting through a very difficult time.
Yeah.
And I would imagine it probably took a year or two for the valley to initially recover from that kind of devastation.
I think for the people to recover, but farmers are very resilient. The land is very forgiving, and they bounced back and resumed feeding George Washington's troops. And so many of the militia at that time that were part of that and did their best went on to participate through Morgan's Rifles up in Saratoga.
Mm-hmm.
So that's some good stories there too.
Yes, yes. Let me get out of this. Someday we'll come up with technology where I can just think it and it'll just appear. So we got a few minutes. You've talked about your farm. Tell us more about it and how you came to have that farm.
Wow, that's a long story.
Okay.
That's a long story. My family ancestry actually goes back about 50 miles south of Schoharie to a small hamlet called Halkett Center. My great grandfather established that settlement, built the church, and was the pastor there for 56 years. So my family homestead really goes back to Van Valkenburg's. And as a young man, as a young boy, I should say, going to visit my grandparents there, milking cows with my grandfather when I was 7. That's probably where I got the bug to be a farmer. And agriculture was very different then. There were a lot of farms in Delaware and Greene County, and there was so many dairy farms all across the country, so many grain farms, so many farmers. Probably 80% of the farmers were the population. So as we got more efficient, and back in those days, one worker could handle 10 cows a day. So if there was a husband and a wife, he'd milk 10, she'd milk 10, and they'd have 10 dried off. So they were pretty much limited to having 30 cows. Of course, agriculture evolved and we're a lot more efficient today. In any event, I thought I'd be a dairy farmer when I was a kid. They retired, sold their farm when I was maybe 11 or 12. So I kept the idea of farming in my head, graduated from high school. When I graduated, I went looking for a job on a farm, got hired. Really, that's when I learned farming. Worked for a great family, good people. I learned to get along with other workers, many of whom spoke Spanish, many of whom went home to their country afterwards. But I learned the skills that I would need to be a crew leader. So I became a crew leader very quickly. And I wound up managing a wonderful farm with a great family for 20 years. But I always held on to the notion of having our own farm someday. After 20 years of that, I guess I had learned enough about farming vegetables, not dairy, and had the optimism. Started thinking about our own place. I found the Schoharie Valley Farms in a publication of Farms for Sale, and came out to me 2 or 3 times through friends saying you should look at this farm. Took a ride out, just saw the possibilities there. More importantly, saw the quality of the land, saw the history there, and said this would be a good farm for us. We were able to negotiate a price with the owners. That was 1993. Agriculture was in kind of a tough time at that place in New York history. Prices have been hard, weather had been hard, markets were difficult. There wasn't a lot of optimism in New York around agriculture. But I think we saw the possibilities for what the farm could do, how productive it might be able to be. Ironically, I was born 13 miles from the farm. So I kind of made a circle around, came back to very near where I was born, said this is home. The farm had been a carrot farm. We'd grown carrots. It had been a dairy farm. It had been a Roman farm until the 1920s or 30s. It was in that same Roman family that was so famous in the 1700s. Changed hands, I think 4 or 5 times on the deed before we took over the property. But the farm had been a very prominent carrot production area, growing carrots for beechnut baby food up in Canajoharie, and then later on growing carrots for 5 chain stores in New York City and the Albany area. And that's when we came in. So immediately I wanted to diversify a little bit, grow some other crops, things I had learned over the 20 years of farming. And we have instituted and expanded a retail business on the farm. But we had the big infrastructure set up around carrots, which was so important. We built greenhouses, and now we're open year round and taking advantage of an evolving marketplace. One of the lessons I learned in the 20 years of learning how to farm, and one of the lessons I learned from the prior owner of the farm, Paul Westheimer, was not to be afraid of change, to actually look for change, seek change out. So many people are afraid of change, but today we try to do 6 things different every year on the farm, whether it's a new piece of equipment, or a new crop, a new way of doing business, to keep us fresh, to keep thinking about the consumer, who our customer is. I knew that the chain stores and the processors were not going to be great customers going forward, that we needed to expand that. And I think from Paul Westheimer, I learned that it's not a good idea to have only one customer because they might get sick. Right. So think about change, think about expanding the customer base. So we have the history there, which is amazing. And because of that history of carrots, we refer to the farm market now as the carrot barn. A lot of history, a lot of reverence for the carrot crops. Still grow a lot of carrots, but we build greenhouses now. We grow so many other diversified vegetable crops. It's easier to talk about what we don't grow than what we grow. But potatoes and carrots and parsnips and beets are going to be part of our history for a long time. But sweet corn, lettuce, broccoli, cabbage, tomatoes, sweet potatoes, things like that. And we're always looking to add other things. So it's a very easy thing to contemplate expanding and taking advantage of the resources you have, access to water, good soils, and access to a marketplace, which we have in the Schoy area.
Is the diversity of production today, how different is it from what you know of what they were producing in the valley during the war?
Well, it's kind of funny you say that, because back during the 17 and 1800s, every farm grew a diverse array of things.
Okay.
Everybody had a few cows for milk. They probably had a few pigs for meat. They probably had a strong vegetable garden because they had to sustain themselves.
Mm-hmm.
They probably grew a market crop. Might be they might have cows and do milk. They might have corn and or grains and produce those. They might make hay. Most of them all did a little bit of everything. So that family homestead idea of having multiple things, eggs not all in one basket, that was so popular. That began to change as agricultural practices and agronomy were better understood. And you saw more farmers becoming really good at one crop, really good at corn, really good at wheat, really good at hay, really good at whatever. And so a little bit of that was lost. I think more in the 1900s, farmers began to specialize. And so the diversity began to go away. And now we're seeing the diversity become a thing again, which is great. Regenerative agriculture, sustainable agriculture. We still support both kinds of systems in New York. You know, onion growers versus potato growers versus dairy versus corn and soybeans. But you're seeing a trend back towards that diversity. For us in the vegetable world, that was desirable to have an array of crops, not just one. Again, so you had more than one customer. You just didn't have one.
Right. And I think, again, going back to the 18th century, with those farmers, as you say, they had to live on. They couldn't go down to the price chopper to pick up what they needed. They had to grow it first, take care of their family needs. Yeah. Going back to your point about the devastation of the valley, that everything they needed to eat was gone. Everything they needed to live was wiped out. So, so many people would like to visit the breadbasket of the Revolution, especially now as we celebrate.
I highly recommend it.
Yeah. Are there sites or particular farms or other places of interest that you would recommend?
You know, I guess the first thing I'd recommend is take a ride down Route 30, because there's so many opportunities along the way. But we're quite proud of the old stone fort, which is now a museum, and open during the main time of the year, closed during the Christmas and winter holidays, but opening very soon in the Schoy area, where they've collected so many items from around that area over the years, including some buildings. There's a schoolhouse there that was moved from another part of the county. They built a Dutch barn there on the property. So there's a number of buildings and little sections that people can explore, walk around. The cemetery is there with the graves of people that were, you know, back in the 1700s. Same family still there farming today. So that's a good place to begin and to learn a little bit about the history of the valley, the geography of the valley, the seasons in the valley.
Okay, good to know. Very good to know. Again, Route 30 is a beautiful ride from anywhere. It's I grew up north of the river, up in Gloversville. So, but I'm familiar with Route 30 going that way a little more than going south. Yeah. But it's a beautiful, beautiful ride. What's the one thing you hope people take away from today's conversation?
That the past is always present. I think there's lots of cliches around history. Those who don't learn their history will be doomed to repeat it. We see that over and over and over again. I'm sure some people are talking about it today.
Mhm.
But I think the resilience of agriculture, the resilience of our people. I remember thinking about the Johnson Brant raid, how devastating that was. I think back to 2011, Hurricane Irene dumped 20 inches on the headwaters of the Scary Creek, which meant the entire Scary Valley, 72,000, 73,000 acres, probably had 10 to 18 feet of water on it.
Mhm.
And that was in August, end of August. So all the farmers lost all their crops. Everything was lost. Very similar to that Johnson Brant era, other than we survived as people and our equipment largely survived. And we went right back to farming the following spring. And I always thought that there's something about the soil, the resilience in the soil was like the resilience in the people, that we're going to come back, that farm again, we're going to be beaten down. So I guess that's what keeps me going.
I think it keeps a lot of us going, Commissioner. Is that resilience is critical, especially in the face of changes in the world, but changes in nature. That 2011 hurricane was nature, and you can't control it. You can't stop it.
That's
You just have to sort of live through it and come out to the other side.
That's right. Learn from that history.
Yes.
Do your best to
Yeah.
do something different.
And it's communities coming together to
Yep.
enable us to do it. And I think one of the things that my limited experience is these communities, particularly in upstate New York and farming communities, they are communities. They are connected people with one another who care about each other, make sure that good things happen, even when bad things do occur.
When I was 7, I decided that I wanted to be a farmer. It would be probably decades later before I realized that what I really wanted to be was like my grandparents, because they were part of a community. Farmers were not just the farming producers, but they were the volunteers at the fire department. They were in the Ladies' Aid Society. They were a critical part of the community. And that's really what I wanted to be.
Mm-hmm. And that's a legacy. And that's a legacy of the Revolutionary War. Those folks settled that from a European settlement perspective, settled that land together, cleared the land together, built those farms together.
Sure.
And said, okay, we're not going to let anyone take this away from us. So we've got some questions that have sort of started to pile up. So I'm going to turn it over to Josie and ask her, what have you got?
Well, we have some really, really great questions. The first one that I will pose to you is, how critical was the Hessian fly's effect on grain production in New York State during the Revolution, or any other pests?
Oh my gosh. I have no idea how big a deal that was. I can only imagine how big a deal a Colorado potato beetle today is, or a European corn borer. I honestly don't know the answer to that, but that is an awesome question. I'm going to try to see if I can find out the answer to that, but I honestly don't know. But if you think about making a living in agriculture 100 years ago, or 200 years ago, or 250 years ago, oh my gosh, every little thing was a big deal. I honestly don't know how they met that challenge. But that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, another question is about whether the burning of the fields by the British may have contributed to the fertility of the soil, similar to prescribed burn practices that you saw among indigenous people as well as Europeans during the colonial period.
Yeah, I'm quite sure it did. There's, known agronomic benefits from burning of fields. It was done quite a lot by Native Americans in the Western Plains, and they always saw immediate resurgence and vitality of the soil. And I don't think they understood probably the extreme benefits of that back in the day, but I'm sure that it added to the fertility in the ground for the next crops, which they sure needed. But I think, the fine silt loam, the high pH, the quality of that soil and the resiliency, the ability to, handle deep-rooted crops and yet, do well in a dry year and still be able to dry out well, be well drained, all help that soil. But I'm sure there was a benefit to the burning that they saw probably the next several years.
And we've talked a lot about the Schoharie Valley today. Do we know anything about the Hudson Valley or farms in Dutchess County and how they contributed or how they fared during this time period?
Yeah, I think every hamlet along the Hudson Valley has its own set of stories like we do in Schoharie. Their heroes and their recognition of the people that fought back and made things work. And of course, the traditions in agriculture in the Hudson Valley are equal to the lore that we have. They had their heroes and they had their people that stood up and their farmers that contributed along the way. My great grandfather drove cattle from Pawcett Center up over the mountains to Kingston. And there he would load the cattle on a barge and they'd go down to New York City. So that's what he did. And I'm sure all along the Hudson Valley there were growers like him that were looking at that big market in New York. But I'm more versed in my own farm and my own valley than Hudson, but rich tradition all the way along there.
You mentioned the big market in New York, particularly during the war. Another area of, I'll say, exploration. New York City was essentially cut off because the British occupied it until 1783, November 23rd.
Yeah.
And so that market, it'd be interesting to do a little analysis at some point. What was the impact on farmers' ability to, I'll say, sell their wares when that big market was gone? And closed off to them,
For sure.
which probably helped them sell to the Continental Army. But again, I'm speculating.
Yeah.
So, sorry, Josie.
That's okay. Do you know?
They too.
Yes, they did.
Do you know what grains were grown and sold to the army? Was it wheat? Was it other grains? And do you happen to know how those grains would have been packaged for shipment?
The wheat was largely predominant there, but also corn. And interestingly enough, I have a friend who was a distiller, very anxious to recreate the alcoholic beverages that were served to the military, to the soldiers, their daily
Gill of rum.
Yes. And the exact varieties of corn that were grown in the Schoharie Valley that would lend themselves to making a good drink. So there was a lot of wheat, a lot of corn, a lot of flint corn, which was very effective in making a good alcoholic beverage at the end of the day.
And hops was a big production item in New York, wasn't it? I think at New York, at one point, New York was the leading hops producer, or somewhere near the top hops producers. Maybe not during the war, but at some point.
Yeah, later on, as we got into the 1800s and 1900s, hops was grown all throughout the valley. Everybody had hops. You can still find wild hops in some of the hillsides in the valley, widely grown and went up the creek. In this case, on our farm between Schoharie, and Central Bridge was, I'm told, the world's shortest narrow gauge railroad. Went from Schoharie to Central Bridge, which was only a few miles, where hops were taken off the train and went onto a larger train and went to the breweries in Amsterdam. But the entire valley went through a period where it was all hops. That was the crop. There was money to be made in that. So a lot of farmers shifted over to hops. Prohibition kind of put a wrinkle in that. A couple of diseases that hops were susceptible to also damaged that. And then back to grains, back to dairy, back to all the other crops we have today.
Great. And then we have one kind of big existential question about, farms and how in many places they're being lost to development. Is that a concern in your area?
It is a concern. It's a concern for me as commissioner and a concern across the state. A lot of pressure, particularly post-World War II, the encroachment of suburbia onto farmland. Farmland's so nice to build on because it's already cleared. And now there's pressures from ongoing suburban sprawl, but also solar interest in that. So it's still something we pay very close attention to. And certainly over the last decade, New York State has elevated itself to the forefront of preserving farmland by helping farmers create easements on their farm to keep their land away from development. So that's something that we think about a lot. We've got a record amount of funding right now in our budget to continue that work. That's a great concern because once land goes out of production, pretty tough to bring it back into production. That keeps us up at night.
Well, I think that, there's one more question that's come in. Have some of the farms in Schoharie converted to cannabis production?
Not significantly. There's a few people looking at it, I believe, but a lot of the cannabis production has gone into controlled environment agriculture, now done in greenhouses. We were and still are excited about hemp. There's over 2,000 uses for industrial hemp. And I think a lot of farmers saw that as an easier rotation for them. Requires special equipment, but our farmers can adapt pretty well to that. And I think the use of hemp in automobile manufacture, in rope making, of course, when it was an important crop for the Navy, and in building materials, insulating materials. As I said, I think there's somewhere around 2,000 known uses for hemp. I think that needs to find its niche and its place in today's agriculture. The cannabis side of things is largely controlled by the Office of Cannabis Management now in New York, but also pretty much a greenhouse controlled environment situation.
I know in the archive's digital collections, we've got a number of photos of hemp production and rope production across New York, because again, New York has been producing hemp for a while.
Yeah.
And but these are from the 20s and the teens.
Yeah.
Photos.
Yeah.
So the 1920s. I have to remember that.
That's right.
So.
Yeah, it was declared illegal,
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, all the memories and the genetics and the knowledge of growing that crop, got changed. And so we got to relearn a few lessons that we learned already some time ago.
Although rope production is probably, I'm going far afield here, but I had the opportunity to visit Belfast, and one of which has been a ship manufacturing place for hundreds of years. And one of the big industries in Belfast until I'll say the middle of the 20th century was rope production.
Yeah.
For all those ships.
Yeah.
Okay, one last question, Commissioner Ball. The people want to know, what is the name of your farm and can they buy vegetables there?
I could be persuaded to sell some vegetables, I think. The name of our farm is Schoharie Valley Farms. We're right on Route 30 in Schoharie, just about a mile north of the village. And the farm market is called the Carrot Barn, which sits prominently on the road there. Yeah, love to have people visit, take a ride through the valley, ask some questions.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thanks to you, Commissioner Ball and Tom, for this insightful presentation today. And thank you to everyone who joined us for this speaker series. If you're interested in learning more about the New York State Archives and the kinds of records they hold, you can visit that website at archives.nysed.gov. And if you're interested in the Archives Partnership Trust and what we do, our website is nysarchivestrust.org. It's our privilege to make these events available to you and to keep New York State's history alive. If you're interested in the content we create and you have great ideas for some future programming, please don't hesitate to send us an email at aptrust@nysed.gov. And just a little housekeeping note that a recording of this session, along with relevant links and registration for the next speaker series, will all come to you in a thank you email that will be sent out to you this week. And please don't forget to join us on May 12th at 12:30 p.m. for our next online speaker series, All Aboard, New York's Short Line Railroads, with retired Lieutenant Colonel Richard Comstock. You can register for that program for free at nysarchivestrust.org or by clicking the link in your thank you email. Thank you again, Commissioner Ball and Tom. We really appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Josie.
What a treat. Thank you so much.